7:18 in Trinidad and Tobago as you take a quick look at the situation along the bypass in San Fernando, where the traffictt.com camera, one of the many throughout the country, would be located. And as per usual, there isn't really any traffic there. But we have a lot of issues. We have a logjam of issues, bumper to bumper, on the table in our discussion with David Abdulah, the leader of the MSJ, the Movement for Social Justice. We heard some of what the Prime Minister had to say just before the 7 o'clock news. Dr. Keith Rowley said that the government's door remains open to proposals from potential investors in the Point-of-Pierre refinery to lease, buy or enter into contractual arrangements with the government for the assets of Paria Fuel Trading. Didn't we hear the Energy Minister say that this was an inadvertent thing? What is really going on? But David Abdulah, David, good to see you once again. Thanks very much for joining us, taking the time to join us this morning. I mean, many issues on the table. We have Venezuela, we have the whole issue of being snubbed, we have many other issues that we want to touch on that impact the politics and the life of us here in Trinidad and Tobago. But what do you make of this Paria Fuel Trading business?
Yes. Morning, Faz, and morning to all your viewers and listeners. The contradictory statements about Petrotrin, the false narratives and so on that emerged since August last year just are continuing. And it's an indication of the fact that this issue of the closure of Petrotrin was never properly thought out. It was never supported by any detailed report. In fact, Mr. Espinay admitted as much before the Industrial Court when he gave evidence last year. He said there were no reports that recommended the closure of Petrotrin. And the closure of the refinery and the sending home of all the workers. He said McKinsey was doing some day-to-day, week-to-week assessments, and they had some PowerPoint slides, and that is what they were going on. So the decision was a bad decision, and you heard Mr. Espinay in Sunday's Express in that interview made the point that Paria was never going to be profitable. But when they made the announcement about these new companies, Heritage, Paria, and so on, they said these are going to be lean, efficient, profitable entities, and business model is the right business model, etc. You heard all of that. But what did he say? He said we only set up Paria because we had to guarantee a supply of fuel to Trinidad and Tobago when we shut down the refinery. It was a hurried decision. I'm paraphrasing it, but more or less. Yeah. And it was never going to be profitable. So the country was constantly being sold a lie. And a number of us came out and spoke and said, this makes no sense, because we understood the industry, we understood the business. I was down in Point Fortin last night. We had a town meeting last night. More than 80 people turned up and so on at relatively short notice. And I left there after 10:30. It finished at 10:30. And oil production in Heritage has fallen to about, the old Trinmar fields, what we call the Trinmar fields, down to about 12 or 14,000 barrels a day from 20,000 odd barrels at the end of August. So oil production has fallen. What we are saying, the Minister of Energy and Mr. Espinay ought to tell the country what is the daily oil production. Don't tell us how many barrels of oil you exported after 3 months, because that's an accumulation. What is the oil production today? What was it in August of last year? And so on. What was it in September, October, November? What is it today? What is the cost of importing fuel by Paria into Trinidad and Tobago? Because we made the point that if you're buying fuel out of Petrotrin, it is different than buying fuel from a trader, which incidentally is BP, which was Robert Riley's former employer, Lisa Ali, who was the head of the transition team at Petrotrin, her former employer, Nigel Campbell, the chief financial officer, his former employer. So you're buying fuel from a trader who has to buy from a refiner, so there are markups all along the way. And then they pay freight and insurance to get it into Trinidad. So what is the actual landed cost of fuel in Trinidad and Tobago? And therefore, what is the extent of the subsidy that is now being paid by the government for that fuel? A whole set of issues that are just covered with mud.
This sounds like a Clico kind of bacchanal in the making, if not even worse as far as impact on the economy. But two questions. One, what from your understanding, and many will see your as a biased political understanding, because you do have a political stake as leader of the MSJ, so let's put that on the table. what are the potential implications of this situation to Trinidad and Tobago in real terms, one, and two, what is the status of the OWTO's bid, its business proposal?
Okay. It makes sense, sorry, and therefore, in a sense, Mr. Espinay and Dr. Rowley are right, and Mr. Khan was wrong. It makes sense for Paria to be sold or leased when the refinery is sold or leased, and it should go to the same bidder, because you can't have a refinery that has to import crude oil and then export products, and it has no access to a port, tank farms, and the pipelines, and so on. And all of those are located in Paria at the moment. So Paria ought to go together with the refinery. And that's the only thing that makes economic sense. It never made sense to have Paria as a standalone company. So that's on the first point. The second issue, I don't know the exact status of the OWTO's bid. I know that they have made a bid for both the refinery and for Paria, on the same basis that I said. It doesn't make sense to disaggregate them. So I know they've made a bid, and they've also made a bid for Augustus Long Hospital. And in my view, it would be the best national interest. I don't know the financials or anything like that, but in my view, it would be in the best interest of Trinidad and Tobago if the OWTO's bid is accepted, because I think that would then preserve a certain sense of our national interest and return some sense of normalcy to the labor market and so on. So that I am plugging for the OWTO's bid because I think that would be in the best interest, as distinct from a foreign energy company, or as distinct from some big local conglomerate here who would just get larger and larger.
But has the evidence of our historical experience, David Abdulah, has it shown us that nationalization actually works? Doesn't it fuel inefficiencies, corruption, a poor work ethic? In some cases, it has done all of those things. But on the other hand, we demonize Petrotrin. And last night, as I said, I was down in Point 14, and I heard Petrotrin workers say, we have applied for jobs. And once people hear they're in Petrotrin, they don't want to hire them, because Petrotrin workers were demonized, wrongly demonized. Because the fact of the matter is that Petrotrin did contribute billions and billions of dollars to Trinidad and Tobago in terms of tax revenue. But wasn't the net effect that it was a drain on the country? No, that is not true. That was part of the false narrative. So that the country never put out, taxpayers never put out a cent of taxpayers' money to subsidize Petrotrin. Petrotrin was never subsidized. True. But who pays these $1 billion in debts? Petrotrin was paying all of its debts. The government had to guarantee towards the last year or two, when oil prices fell in 2015, 16, 17, Petrotrin went into a cash problem. And so it borrowed money, and the government guaranteed some of those debts, not all, it guaranteed some of those debts. But there was no inflow of money from the Treasury into Petrotrin in the way that, say, some other state enterprises get a direct subvention. You will never find in the government's books subvention or transfer of money from the taxpayers' money into Petrotrin. And what has happened is that the government was saying, remember during that period, government was saying, this debt is going to sink the country, our debt to GDP ratio is going to go up, Moody's is going to downgrade us, blah, blah, blah. And we said all of that was a false narrative, that if you close down the refinery and send home all the workers, the cost of doing that is going to be more than Petrotrin's debt. And Mr. Espinay admitted they now are seeking to borrow $1.4 billion US to pay off the $850 million bullet payment. That's what I was going to get to.
Yes, and pay off the severance pay, and pay off the liability to the pension fund, plus, and Paria is losing money, and I want to believe that Heritage is going to be losing money too, and so on and so on and so on.
But just one, and I mean, forgive me, it sounds like a stupid question, but
no question is stupid.
I suppose, but depending. How is it possible? I take your point about it not being a drain on the Treasury and so on. But how is it possible that an oil company racks up debts to the tune of billions of dollars to the extent to which Petrotrin did?
Because some very bad investment decisions were made by the Malcolm Jones board, supported by the Energy Subcommittee of Cabinet headed by, at the time, Prime Minister Manning. And those bad investment decisions were with respect to the refinery upgrades, what is known as the gas optimization project, where the plants ran, the cost of the plants doubled, and in some cases more than doubled, and the length of time to get the plants on stream increased by many, many years. So as a result of that, huge amounts of money were either borrowed or cash was injected from Petrotrin's operations into those projects, and there was no immediate return on those investments. And as a result of that focus purely on the refinery, you also then had a lack of focus on the producing fields where you needed to increase oil production, and you had a lack of focus on aged infrastructure. And one of the plants, for example, the ultra-low sulfur diesel plant, never got started because when it was about to get started up, there were design flaws. And that
we had World GTL as well, the gas to liquids.
Well, that was a horrendous decision, and so on. So there were bad decisions that were taken by people, and then there was bad project management and a whole range of things like that. So that is why we ended up in that problem. It is not because inherently Petrotrin was going to be a losing company. In fact, in the last few months of last year that Petrotrin was operating, was making a profit.
But who is to say, David Abdulah, if you were to say, well, okay, let's throw out this idea, abandon this idea, and let OWTU take over whatever. Isn't there always the risk of having these same poor decisions because of really not having that profit and loss capitalist sort of philosophy of making sure this is a working, profitable entity, and therefore you could have even worse decisions being made? Yes,
and of course, I mean, OWTU doesn't have the money to buy the refinery, so it has to go out and get investors who are going to also want to make sure that their investment is secured. So there will be a pressure on whoever is managing the company, and I don't know what the arrangements are. I believe they will discuss some management team and so on. So the management is going to have to run it as a profitable business. There's no doubt about that. But there's no reason why you can't have a unionized work environment that is seeking the national interest and that is profitable. They're not necessarily incompatibles. The problem always was political interference. And that is what the Lashley Committee, of which I was a member, referred to, that once you have political interference, as you saw, for example, by these contradictory statements. So Mr. Esmine makes one statement. Then the line minister, the next day makes a contradictory statement. Then the prime minister makes another statement. And that is where you have problems, where you have different agendas being pursued, which make the business change direction one way, the other way. They don't know which way they're going. They're like a person who is giddy, and eventually the thing collapses.
And spin it up in mud or in oil. In this case.
Yes.
And before we shift to other issues on the table, including Venezuela, including Trinidad and Tobago's position together with other nations of the Caribbean, where do you see this thing heading? Where do you see the way things are going, the trends that you're seeing, because you know the oil sector very well. Where do you see this thing going?
Left up to this government and Mr. Esmia and so on, heritage is going to be sold, most likely to some foreign entity in part or in whole, in which case we'd have lost control of our oil industry almost completely. If the refinery does not go to the OWTU and it goes to some multinational, then we are back to colonial days in terms of our oil industry, which would be a horrendous day. We'd have destroyed our ownership of our assets. We'd have destroyed our human resource capacity to manage and run our own affairs, and we have destroyed lives of thousands of people. As I said, that was the only point, and I heard people's stories. And we're destroying people's lives.
But even that, David, that doesn't make political sense. Why would a government do something like that if it is what you're saying is true, when it clearly will bring about their political downfall? Why would you do something like that?
Well, it might result in not the downfall of everyone, because particular interests might be well served by those kinds of decisions. So you retrench all the security workers who are state constables employed by Petrotrin. You send all of them home, though you need to secure the assets, and then you hire a private firm amalgamated to secure the assets. Who benefits?
Indeed, lots of issues tied in there. But again, the issue that is something that is ongoing and something that we're continuing to follow to get different perspectives. Another issue is the situation re Venezuela, re Maduro, Guaido, Donald Trump, or as per usual, the United States see this as their domain. And therefore, it's clearly a snub. It's clearly, I don't know why people are trying to read all kind of different things. Well, he meeting with the North nations, now he going to meet with the South ones later and talking all sorts of things. It's basically the Americans called on the Caribbean to take sides.
Yes.
And Donald Trump is showing his support to those who took his side. How do you see this playing out for Trinidad and Tobago?
Yeah, well, first of all, I hope that those CARICOM leaders who go to the meeting with Mr. Trump don't sell their region for a few trinkets. It is a typical imperial colonial divide and rule. So we pick those who we think are nice boys, and we work with them, and we give them a little perk, some trinkets, and we get them to do our bidding. But
it's the same as the Cricket West Indies election, which we don't have time to get into.
Well, yeah, the government of Friday News spot.
Exactly.
Yes.
But basically,
yes.
It's essentially, Andrew Holness might be saying, look, we have a lot more, so we can't afford to damage our relations with the USA. The Bahamas, I mean, they live off tourism.
Yes.
The vast majority of their visitors would be Americans. Whatever Trump tell them to do, they probably feel that they have to do. So they might have the broader CARICOM and Caribbean concerns, but they say we have to see about we people first.
Yeah, but ultimately, that kind of a behavior has never resulted in our people benefiting, while people are talking about the region generally.
Yes.
So Jamaica, from where, remember Seaga was ring and finger with Reagan with the invasion
That's how we won the election in 1980, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Well, yes, and then he called a snap election in '84 after the Grenada invasion to ride that tide and so on, and the PNP stayed out and that kind of thing. But that didn't resolve Jamaica's economic problems. That didn't make the lives of ordinary Jamaicans any better. They continue to suffer. In fact, the situation went from bad to worse, and so on and so on. So those kind of political games of thinking you're going to play up to the masters up north don't work ultimately.
But it sells very well with the populace. If you talk to people all around, they say, boy, it was a lead story last week. The news media, their second story, after whatever else happened, their second story was you don't need to go and turn up to apply for your visa anymore. Yeah. There is this fixation with the United States being able to have access to the United States, being able to benefit from all the experience of the USA, media, popular culture, and everything else. We in Trinidad and Tobago, as with much of the world, feel we can't do without the US.
Yes, and to some extent, because we are in a globalized environment, and therefore economic relations and other things, we have to have economic relations. I'm not suggesting that we try to break those ties, but you have to try to do it on the basis of at the same time maintaining your dignity and so on. I think and maintaining your self-respect.
Dignity don't pay the bills. If they put the squeeze on us financially, that you can't use your credit cards anymore.
Yes.
What do we do?
Which of course is all those issues that the Parliament was debating some time ago, and the EU is now blacklisting us. Is all of those things. So yes, the power of a few countries in the world to determine how you operate your affairs is important. The United States, and I didn't work with the book, but Bob Woodward wrote a book about Trump's administration called Fair, and there's a major quote, there's a quote in it speaking about cyber warfare. And the fact, in the Obama administration, they were considering cyber warfare against North Korea, and they decided against it because they had to go through China's servers to get to North Korea. And the Chinese might have thought it was a cyber attack on them, and that could have resulted in a counter attack on the United States, which could have shut down all your financial activities, the internet, your power grids, and everything else, and so on. So that the capacity of those big countries to do damage to us as small countries is tremendous. They could shut down our power, as they did in Venezuela, simply by cyber attacks and so on. They could cut us off of international trade. They could hit us with embargoes. And so it is a difficult situation. But at the same time that happens, we have to recognize that we have also had a proud tradition of independence, of coming out of colonialism, and so on. And therefore, we have to hold on to some element of our sense of self-respect and dignity as a sovereign nation and as a region. And so I hope that those leaders don't sell out for a few trinkets, I'm not confident that they won't, but I hope that they don't. And, and therefore, while I attack the government on Petrotrin relentlessly and say they're guilty of high economic crimes, on the other hand, I support the government on the issue of the position it has taken on Venezuela and on sovereignty.
Let's take a break because we have a few minutes left with David Abdulah. We still want to get his own sense of what is happening in Venezuela and the managing of that situation as well. And indeed, they're having an event. The MSJ will be in Carnage this morning at the Hague Street Community Center. We'll have some time to chat on that as well. We'll be right back. 7:40 in Trinidad and Tobago as the traffic on this Friday morning moves along Track Rate Road into and out of Port of Spain, heading west towards St. James. Let's return to studio as we continue our dialogue with David Abdulah, who will be heading west to Carnage. Let's quickly mention that you'll be at the Hague Street Community Centre at 10 o'clock this morning. Yes, and then from there we're going to go into some areas, Upper Hague Street, Seaview Road and so on, where residents are having major problems of water. Now, these were the areas that a week ago, heavy gunfire, problems up there, police presence and stuff like that. But we have members up inside there and they have problems, so we are interacting with the community as part of our mission to work with people and to fight with people for a better life. And obviously, there's a political imperative to it as well, but as with many of these similar type communities, die-hard PNM, they ain't going to change. Well, a lot of them are saying, they haven't seen a member of parliament for ages. That don't matter, they will still vote some of them will, some of them will, a lot of them will, but a lot of them are saying they need to get out of that syndrome of PNM till they're dead, because their life is not improving with the government as it is. And that is why I could go up inside there with some of our members and walk those communities. All right, let's talk about now. And interestingly, it's on World Water Day. World Water Day. We didn't choose it because of that. It was purely accidental. It was good timing, good planning in that sense. But let's talk about the Venezuelan situation more specifically and what is happening there, the deteriorating situation. How much longer can you continue to defend the Maduro regime, given what has happened in the country? Yeah, and it's not simply about defending the Maduro regime per se. It's saying that President Maduro was elected. We have maintained that the way forward is by way of dialogue between the opposition and the government, and to therefore have an agreement, as had been hammered out a year ago in April last year, was it? There was an agreement, February last year. Prior to the elections. How legitimate was that? Because we've had nationals from Venezuela who have made they stated their case that they are against the Maduro regime. But they have said that according to the constitution of Venezuela, as they understand it, that election was not proper. It was, because it was conducted by the same electoral commission that oversaw the election of the National Assembly some years before, by which Mr. Guaido was elected. So you can't say that one election by which I was elected was okay, and then the election by which you were elected is not okay. And there were elections for state governors, and members of the opposition parties won some of those state governors. It was the same process, overseen by the same electoral commission. There was an agreement in February, hammered out by, facilitated by former Prime Minister of Spain, supported by President of the Dominican Republic and presidents of 4 other Latin American governments, or representatives of presidents of 4 Latin American governments. And there was an agreement, the opposition agreed, and the government agreed to having presidential elections early. That's why the presidential elections were held early last year, because there was that agreement. And at the last minute, the day in which it was to be signed, the opposition walked away from it. And the Prime Minister of Spain, and I have that letter, wrote to the opposition and said, well, listen, this was the agreement that we worked on after months. It was difficult, but it didn't only deal with elections. It dealt with issues of governance, of political prisoners, of the economy, of ending sanctions by the U.S., a whole range of issues to return Venezuela to some normalcy so that there will be some unity again. And that is the only way forward, which is what the Montevideo mechanism was proposing, which is why we supported that mechanism. And interestingly, the U.S. seemed to have reached a stalemate, because they were hoping to have Guaido
becoming president and Maduro would have fallen with mass demonstrations early this year. That didn't happen. Then they tried the humanitarian thing. And they burned the trucks, It wasn't Maduro, they burned the trucks, It was the opposition burned the trucks.
Isn't it a question of who we believe, David Abdulah? Do we believe Guaido or do we believe Maduro?
But the international media, which initially said that it was the government forces and so on, have now come around and say, well, maybe it was the opposition. People were throwing petrol bombs that set the trucks on fire. There was a recent report on CNN, I don't know if you saw it, by Nick Payton-Walsh, who interviewed the people who actually organized the drone bomb attack, which in the last year against President Maduro, when there was which people said that was Maduro doing it to himself.
Yes.
But CNN interviewed the guys who organized it and said, yeah, they tried to assassinate Maduro. And even after the power blackouts and the water problems, one of the CNN reporters, I'm not going by CNN all the time, I'm not saying this is David speaking now.
Yeah.
Even CNN had to admit that the largest pro-government demonstration was held last week, Saturday, after the power outages, after all of those difficulties. So there is a stalemate where the opposition has support, there's no doubt. The government has support, there's no doubt. And what is the way forward in that situation? The way forward can be external intervention. You have to remove the sanctions because that is causing and precipitating a lot of the humanitarian problems. And so if you have a release of the sanctions and so on, and a negotiated settlement between the government and the opposition with respect to future elections, for the presidency, for the National Assembly, have another set of elections perhaps. But in that situation, you also have to have agreement that whoever loses abides by the will of the majority and does not continue to or begin to destabilize.
David, time has run out on us. Thanks very much for taking the time to join us this morning. It might be a bit of a stretch to get you out this early in the morning to join us.
No, it's all right. I left point at 11 o'clock last night, but,
okay,
it's all right. We didn't talk about cricket and the rigged elections of cricket West Indies.
Well, that is a whole different story, and we'll wait to see how that turns out. Although the big issue for me in relation to that is that whether it's Skerritt or Cameron, it's the governance model that is the problem.
But the question is, who could change the governance model? And therefore, you have to have somebody elected in who then change it, which is also Trinidad and Tobago. Who will change the governance model of Trinidad and Tobago? MSJ. Exactly. You have to get us in there to change it because those who are in there wouldn't change it.
That's too intricate, at this hour of the morning. David Abdulah, as always, is used. When we come back, we'll look to take some of your phone calls in praise of our Special Olympics team. 56 medals from the United Arab Emirates. The Jamaicans have editorialized on their team with 35 medals, and we seem to take it well. They're just something that other people are doing. We'll be back right after this.